The twins were running barefoot on asphalt, and the man in the silver sedan almost didn't stop. Jonathan Cross had seen desperate people before, in boardrooms, in war zones, in the mirrors of five-star hotels where men like him pretended their fortunes didn't leave shadows. But these children, these two girls with braided hair matted with dirt and fear carved into their faces, they weren't performing. They were dying from the inside out. His driver had already begun to accelerate when Cross saw it. The rope burns. Fresh. Red. Wrapped around their wrists like accusations. "Stop the car!" The sedan lurched to a halt. Security was already reaching for their weapons, trained to expect ambush, kidnapping, extortion. Children were props in this world. Leverage. Bait. But when the taller girl collapsed against his window, her small fists hammering the glass, Cross saw something he hadn't seen in years. Truth.
"Please!"
she screamed.
"They're going to kill her!"
Cross lowered the window halfway. His face was stone, his voice measured. "Who?"
"Our Mum!"
the other girl sobbed, her voice cracking.
"They tied her to a tree. She's still there. She's still alive. Please!"
His head of security leaned in. "Sir, we need to move. This could be—" "Check it," Cross said, eyes locked on the girls. The man hesitated. "Sir? I said, check it." Seconds later, his security chief was on the phone, his expression shifting from skepticism to something darker. He covered the receiver. "There's a woman tied to an oak tree on the edge of Redwood County. No warrant, no charges filed. Local deputies are guarding her." Cross felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd built his empire on calculated risks, on knowing when to walk away, on understanding that power wasn't about saving everyone. It was about saving yourself first. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory stirred. A name he hadn't spoken in years. Grace. "How long has she been there?" he asked quietly. The security chief listened, then looked up. "Since dawn, sir. They're saying by sunset." Cross checked his watch. 4 hours. 4 hours until a woman died while a town watched. The taller girl, Eli, he would learn later, grabbed his sleeve through the window. Her fingers were shaking, but her grip was iron. "You're rich," she whispered. "Everyone knows you. If you tell them to stop, they'll listen. Please, please don't let our Mum die." Cross looked at her. Really looked. 9 years old, maybe 10. Old enough to know what death looked like. Young enough to believe a stranger could stop it. He could leave. He could drive away. He could let Redwood County bury its own sins. But those rope burns, those fresh, red rope burns. "Get in," he said. And just like that, the countdown began. Grace Carter had stopped screaming an hour ago. Not because the pain had lessened. Her wrists were raw, the rope cutting deeper with every shallow breath. But because screaming took energy she no longer had. The old oak tree stood at the edge of her property, its branches stretching over land her grandfather had worked, her father had bled for, and she had refused to surrender. Now it was her gallows. Deputy Marcus Hale, no relation to the company, he always said, though everyone knew better, leaned against his patrol car, arms crossed, watching her like a man waiting for bread to toast. "You should have signed," he called out. "All this could have been avoided." Grace didn't answer. Her throat was too dry. Her vision blurred at the edges. Behind Hale, 2 other men stood guard. Not deputies. Enforcers. The kind Hale Development hired when signatures didn't come willingly. One of them checked his watch. 4 more hours. he muttered. Think she'll last? Don't matter, Hale said. Boss said sunset. Sunset it is. Grace closed her eyes. Her daughters. God, her daughters. She'd sent them away at dawn, pressed every dollar she had into Eli's hand, and told them to run, to find someone, anyone. But Redwood County didn't have heroes. It had men like Hale, men who wore badges and collected paychecks from the highest bidder. Men who turned away when farmers lost their land, when wells ran dry, when mothers hung from trees. Her arms were going numb. That was good, she thought distantly. Numbness meant the end was close. She thought of her daughters' faces, Eli's fierce eyes, Noah's soft hands, the way they'd clung to her that morning, refusing to let go until she'd growled at them to run. I love you, she'd whispered as they disappeared into the mist. Don't look back. But they had. Of course they had. Because children always looked back. A crow landed on a branch above her, cawing once before flying off. Grace's head lolled forward. How long now? 3 hours? 2? She tried to lift her head, but the effort was too much. Somewhere in the distance, she heard an engine. Hale heard it too. He straightened, hand moving to his belt. Expecting company? One of the enforcers asked. No, Hale said slowly. We ain't. The engine grew louder, closer, and then, cutting through the morning haze, a silver sedan appeared on the dirt road leading to the oak tree. It stopped 50 feet away. The door opened. A man stepped out. Tall, expensive suit. The kind of presence that made the air feel heavier. Hale squinted. Who the hell? Jonathan Cross, the man said, his voice carrying across the field like a judge's gavel. Hale went pale. Everyone in California knew that name. Billionaire, contractor, the man who'd rebuilt half of San Francisco and buried the other half's opposition. Mr. Cross, Hale stammered, forcing a smile. This is private property. We're handling a what? Cross interrupted, his eyes moving past Hale to the woman hanging from the tree. A lynching. Now hold on. How long has she been there? Hale hesitated. Sir, this is a legal matter. How long? The deputy swallowed. Since dawn. Cross checked his watch. Then he looked at Grace. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow. Dying. Behind him, the twins climbed out of the car. Mom! Eli screamed. Grace's eyes flickered open, and for the first time in hours, she felt something other than pain. Hope. Cut her down, Cross said. Hale stepped forward. Sir, with all due respect, you can't. Cross turned to face him fully. I'm going to say this once. Cut her down, or I'll make one phone call, and by tomorrow morning, you won't have a badge. You won't have a job. You won't have a name anyone remembers. Hale's jaw tightened. You threatening me? No, Cross said calmly. I'm telling you what's going to happen. For a moment, no one moved. Then Hale spat on the ground and motioned to his men. Cut her loose. One of the enforcers hesitated. Boss said, I said cut her loose. The man pulled out a knife and approached the tree. Grace felt the rope slacken, felt her body drop, felt strong hands catch her before she hit the ground. I've got you, Cross said quietly. You're safe now. Grace looked up at him, her vision swimming, and then she whispered a name she hadn't spoken in 15 years. Jonathan?
His entire body went rigid. Somewhere behind them, the twins were crying, but Cross couldn't hear them. Because the woman in his arms, the woman he'd just saved, was the one he'd left behind. Redwood County had been dying for a decade. Not fast, not dramatically. Just slowly, quietly. The way small towns do when corporations discover them. First, the lumber mill closed, then the processing plant, then the family-owned stores on Main Street, one by one, boarded up and forgotten. What remained was land, hundreds of acres of it, fertile, valuable, prime real estate for anyone with enough money to take it. Hale Development had that money, and they had patience. They started small, offering generous buyouts to struggling farmers, promising jobs, promising progress, promising a future that looked nothing like the past. Some families sold willingly, others held out. And for those who held out too long, Hale Development had other methods. Legal fees that buried farmers in debt, zoning changes that made farming impossible, wells that mysteriously ran dry, livestock that mysteriously died. And when all else failed, Sheriff Marcus Hale. He wasn't elected, not really. Elections required opposition, and opposition required courage. In Redwood County, courage was expensive. Hale wore a badge, carried a gun, and did what the company paid him to do. He wasn't the first corrupt lawman in California. He wouldn't be the last. But he was effective. Under his watch, 12 families had voluntarily sold their land. 3 more had simply disappeared, relocated, Hale said, though no one ever heard from them again. The county had learned to look away, because looking away kept you safe. Looking away kept your children fed. Looking away meant you might survive long enough to escape. Grace Carter had been a
problem from the beginning. She'd inherited the land after her father's death 3 years ago. 200 acres bordering the river, the single most valuable piece of property Hale Development didn't own. They'd offered her twice the market value. She'd refused. They'd offered her triple. She'd refused. They'd sent lawyers, accountants, men in expensive suits who smiled and spoke softly about her children's future. She'd refused them all. "This land isn't for sale," she'd said simply. "It's my daughter's inheritance. It's all I have to give them." That had been 6 months ago. Last week, her well had run dry. A tractor's engine had seized. A barn had caught fire in the middle of the night. Arson, obviously, but the fire marshal had ruled it accidental. Yesterday, Marcus Hale had arrived at her door with a final offer. "Sign," he'd said, "or you'll regret it." Grace had slammed the door in his face. This morning they'd come for her. Not with warrants, not with charges. With rope. They'd dragged her from her home while her daughters screamed. They'd tied her to the oak tree while the sun rose. They'd promised her that by sunset she'd be dead. And no one had stopped them. Not the neighbors who heard her daughters crying. Not the shopkeeper who watched the patrol car drive past. Not the pastor who'd baptized Grace's children. Because in Redwood County, stopping Marcus Hale meant joining Grace at the tree. Hale Development had built an empire on fear, and fear was the most profitable currency in the world. But they'd made one mistake. They'd assumed Grace's daughters would run and hide. They'd assumed 2 9-year-old girls couldn't reach anyone who mattered. They'd assumed wrong. Now, as Grace lay on the ground, her wrists finally freed, her daughters clinging to her, Jonathan Cross stood in the middle of that field and saw exactly what Redwood County had become. A graveyard of dignity, a monument to cowardice,
a place where power had rotted so thoroughly that children had to beg strangers to save their mother. Marcus Hale was sweating now. His hand hovered near his gun, but he didn't draw it. Couldn't. Not with Cross watching. "This is county business," Hale said, his voice shaking slightly. "You got no authority here." Cross looked at him like he was studying an insect. "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't have authority here." Hale relaxed slightly. "But I have something better." Cross pulled out his phone. One call. That's all it took. One call to a governor who owed him a favor. One call to a senator who needed his donations. One call to a federal investigator who'd been looking for a reason to tear Hale Development apart. Hale watched Cross's face as he spoke quietly into the phone. And for the first time in years, Marcus Hale felt afraid. Because Jonathan Cross wasn't just rich. He was connected. And connection, in the end, was more powerful than any badge. When Cross hung up, he looked at Hale one last time. "They're coming,"
he said simply. "All of them." Hale's face went white. Behind him, the enforcers exchanged glances, and in the distance, barely audible, the sound of helicopter blades began to echo across the valley. The twins had been walking for 3 hours before they reached the highway. Their feet were bleeding, their lungs burned, but they didn't stop. Eli led the way, her hand locked around Noah's wrist, dragging her sister forward whenever she stumbled. "We have to keep going," Eli whispered. "We have to." Noah was crying, but silently. The kind of crying that happened when your body had nothing left. "Where are we going?" she managed. Eli didn't answer, because she didn't know. Their mother had told them to find help, to find someone with power. But who had power in Redwood County? Not the sheriff, not the mayor, not the pastor or the teachers or the neighbors who used to bring casseroles when their father died. Everyone was afraid. Everyone looked away. The only people with real power were the ones who'd tied their mother to that tree. Eli's mind raced as they walked. She'd heard stories, rumors, whispers about men who lived in the city, men with money and influence, men who could make problems disappear. But she was 9 years old. She didn't have phone numbers or addresses or any idea how to reach someone like that. All she had was rage and a promise she'd made to her mother. "I'll find someone. I'll bring them back. I won't let you die." When they reached the highway, Eli stopped. She looked left, then right. Empty road, morning fog, no cars. Noah collapsed onto the gravel shoulder, gasping. "I can't," she whispered. "Eli, I can't walk anymore." Eli knelt beside her, forcing herself to sound calm. "Just a little further, I promise." "To where?" That's when Eli saw it. A sign, half hidden in the mist. Redwood County, Private Airport, 2 miles. Her heart jumped. An airport meant planes. Planes meant rich people. Rich people meant... "Come on," Eli said, pulling Noah to her feet. "I can't." "Yes, you can. We're almost there." It took them another hour to reach the airport. By the time they stumbled through the gates, security was already moving toward them. "Hey, you kids can't be here." Eli ignored them, scanning the tarmac desperately. There, a private jet. Sleek, expensive, the kind that belonged to someone important. And near it, a man in a dark suit,
speaking into his phone. Eli ran. Security grabbed her arm, but she wrenched free, screaming, "Help! Please! They're going to kill our mom!" The man looked up. For a moment, their eyes met, and Eli saw something she hadn't expected. Exhaustion. Not physical, deeper, the kind that came from years of hearing people beg. But she didn't care. "Please!" she screamed again, and this time Noah was beside her, sobbing, both of them filthy and desperate and breaking apart. Security was dragging them back now, but the man lifted a hand. "Wait." Everyone stopped. He walked toward them slowly,
his expression unreadable. "What did you say?" he asked quietly. Eli's voice cracked. "Our mom. They tied her to a tree. She's still there. She's still alive. Please, you have to help us." The man studied her. His eyes moved to her wrists. The rope burns. Fresh. Red. Real. He turned to his security chief. "Check it." "Sir, this could be—" "I know what it could be. Check it anyway." Minutes crawled by. Eli and Noah stood there, shaking, while the man made calls and his security team moved with cold efficiency. Then the security chief returned, his face grim. "There's a woman tied to an oak tree on the Carter property. Local deputies are guarding her. No warrant on file. No charges. They're calling it a civil matter." The man's jaw tightened. "How long?" "Since dawn, sir. They're saying—" He hesitated. "They're saying sunset." Eli's knees buckled. Sunset. That was only a few hours away. The man looked at her again. Really looked. And then he said something that changed everything. "Get in the car." Eli blinked. "What?" "You heard me. Get in the car. Both of you." Noah grabbed Eli's hand. "Is he going to help?" Eli didn't know, but she didn't have a choice. They climbed into the silver sedan, their filthy clothes staining the leather seats. The man sat across from them, silent. As the car pulled away from the airport, heading back toward Redwood County, Eli finally found her voice. "Who are you?" The man didn't look at her. "Jonathan Cross." Eli's breath caught. Even she knew that name. Everyone did. The billionaire. The fixer. The man who'd built empires and destroyed anyone who stood in his way. "Why are you helping us?" she whispered. Cross finally met her eyes, and for just a moment his mask slipped. "Because someone should have helped me once," he said quietly. "And no one did." The car sped toward the oak tree, toward grace, toward a reckoning 15 years in the making. Jonathan Cross had stopped believing in innocence a long time ago. You didn't build a billion-dollar empire by trusting people. You built it by assuming everyone lied. Everyone cheated. Everyone wanted something. The twins sitting across from him in the sedan? They wanted their mother saved. That much was obvious. What wasn't obvious was whether their story was true. Children lied, not maliciously necessarily, but desperately. When they were scared, when they were coached, when they needed a hero badly enough to invent one. Cross had seen it before. A girl in Mumbai claiming her father was kidnapped. Turned out he'd just run off with another woman.
A boy in Chicago swearing his mother was being held hostage. She'd been dead for 3 years, and the kid had been living with her body. Trauma made people unreliable, and unreliable people made bad investments. Still, those rope burns. Cross couldn't stop looking at them. Fresh, deep, the kind that came from struggling against restraints. "Tell me everything," he said quietly, "from the beginning."
Eli wiped her face with her sleeve. Her voice was hoarse, but steady. "They came this morning, before the sun came up."
"Who?"
"Deputy Hale and 2 other men. They broke our door down. Mom tried to fight, but..." Her voice cracked. Noah took over, her words tumbling out in a rush. "They dragged her outside. We tried to stop them, but they pushed us away. They tied her to the old oak tree, the one by the river. They said if she didn't sign the papers, she'd hang there until sunset."
"What papers?" Cross asked.
"The land deed," Eli said. "Hale Development wants our property. They've been trying to get Mom to sell for months. She kept saying no."
Cross leaned back, processing. Land disputes, corporate pressure, corrupt local enforcement. It was plausible. Depressingly plausible. But plausible didn't mean true. "Why didn't you call the police?" he asked. The twins stared at him like he'd spoken another language. "Deputy Hale is the police," Eli said quietly. "He runs the whole county. Everyone's afraid of him." "What about the FBI? State police?" "We're 9, Eli said flatly. "We don't have a phone. We don't have anyone's number. All we had was our feet." Cross studied her. She didn't look away. Most children would have. Most children couldn't hold a billionaire's gaze. But Eli wasn't most children. She was a survivor. And survivors learned early that weakness got you killed. His phone buzzed. His security chief. The preliminary report. Cross read it quickly. Woman confirmed that the location. Multiple witnesses saw her being taken by deputy and unknown individuals. No warrant filed. No arrest record. Local authorities refusing to comment. His jaw tightened. It was real. All of it. He'd been looking for an excuse to dismiss this, to walk away, to let Redwood County handle its own darkness. But now he had a choice. He looked at the twins again. Eli's eyes were red but fierce. Noah's hands were shaking. Both of them were holding on to each other like they were the only solid things left in the world. And suddenly, Cross was 23 again, standing in a desert in Iraq, watching a village burn because he'd been ordered not to intervene. Because intervention meant casualties, meant complications, meant risk. He'd walked away that day. He'd followed orders, and he'd spent the next 20 years building an empire to convince himself it had been the right choice. But sometimes, late at night, when the whiskey didn't work and the silence was too loud, he remembered the faces of the people he'd left behind. The ones he could have saved, if he'd been brave enough, if he'd been better. Cross closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them and looked at Eli. "If I do this," he said quietly, "if I go to that tree and your mother isn't there, or if this is some kind of setup..." "She's there," Eli interrupted. "She's there and she's dying. and you're the only person who can stop it." Cross nodded slowly. "All right. All right," Noah whispered. "You mean—" "I mean,
"I'm going to get your mother back," Cross said. "But I need you to understand something." Both girls leaned forward. "The men who did this, they're not going to stop because I ask nicely. They're not going to walk away because I'm rich. If I do this, I'm going to war with them. And war is messy." Eli's voice didn't waver. "I don't care. Just save her." Cross almost smiled. "Almost. You're braver than you should have to be," he said quietly. "We're not brave," Eli said. "We're just out of options." Cross understood that feeling. He'd been out of options once too. The car accelerated toward the oak tree, toward Grace, toward the moment Jonathan Cross would finally choose to be the man he'd always pretended to be. Grace's eyes were closed when Cross knelt beside her. His security team had already cut the ropes, already checked her vitals, already called for medical assistance. But Cross couldn't move, because the woman lying on the ground in front of him, bruised, barely conscious, fighting for every breath, was Grace Mitchell. His Grace. 15 years ago, Grace Mitchell had been a waitress in San Francisco. 22 years old, working double shifts to pay for nursing school, dreaming of a life bigger than the one she'd been born into. Jonathan had been 27, fresh out of the military, starting his first real estate company with money he'd saved and morals he'd buried. They'd met at a diner on Market Street. She'd spilled coffee on his laptop. He'd laughed instead of yelling. And for 6 months, they'd been inseparable. She'd made him believe he could be more than what the world had taught him to be. Made him believe that money wasn't the only measure of success, that power didn't have to come with blood on your hands. He'd promised her things, a future, a home, a life where she wouldn't have to work herself to exhaustion just to survive. And then his company had taken off. Investors, contracts, opportunities that required him to be someone else, someone harder, someone willing to do what success demanded. Grace had seen the change in him, the late nights that became weeks, the compromises that became principles. The man who'd laughed at spilled coffee replaced by someone who saw people as assets. She'd asked him to stop, to slow down, to remember who he'd been. He'd told her she didn't understand. "I'm doing this for us," he'd said, "for our future." "I don't want a future where I lose you," she'd replied. They'd fought, badly. And one night, Cross had said something he'd regretted ever since. "If you can't handle this, maybe you should find someone else." Grace had looked at him for a long moment. Then she'd left. No screaming, no tears, just quiet devastation. He'd told himself she'd come back, that she'd realize he was right, that success required sacrifice. She never came back. 6 months later, he'd tried to find her. She was gone. No forwarding address, no trace. He'd hired investigators. They'd found nothing. Eventually, he'd stopped looking. Told himself it didn't matter, that he'd moved on, that she'd just been a chapter in a book he'd outgrown. But sometimes, in those late-night moments when whiskey didn't work, he wondered, where was she? Was she happy? Did she ever think about him? Now he knew. She'd been here, in Redwood County, raising 2 daughters alone,
fighting to keep the only thing she had left. And he'd almost let her die. "Grace," he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. Then her breath caught. "Jonathan?" Her voice was barely audible. "Is that really you?" He nodded, unable to speak. "What are you doing here?" she managed. "Your daughters," he said quietly. "They found me. They begged me to help." Tears slipped down Grace's cheeks. "You came," she whispered. "After everything, you came." Cross's throat tightened. "I should have come sooner," he said. "I should have found you years ago." "You didn't know." "I should have tried harder." Grace closed her eyes. "Jonathan." "When you left," he said, the words coming out in a rush, "I told myself it was your choice, that you'd walked away. But the truth is, I pushed you away. I chose money over you, power over you, and I've regretted it every single day since." Grace opened her eyes again, searching his face. "You built an empire," she said softly. "Everyone knows your name." "And I'm empty," Cross said. "I have everything, Grace. Everything except the things that matter. And seeing you here, seeing what I almost let happen." He stopped, his voice breaking. Grace reached up with trembling fingers and touched his cheek. "You saved me," she whispered. "You came when no one else would. That matters." Behind them, the twins were crying, holding each other. Medical helicopters were already inbound. Federal agents, state investigators. Jonathan Cross had made one phone call, and the machinery of justice was finally turning. But none of it felt like enough, because the woman he'd loved, the woman he'd lost, had nearly died while he lived in luxury. And no amount of money could ever fix that. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. "Not this time. I'm going to make sure you're safe. I'm going to make sure they pay. And I'm going to—" "Jonathan," Grace interrupted gently, "one thing at a time." He nodded, swallowing hard. "One thing at a time," he repeated. But as he helped her sit up, as her daughters ran to her side, as the sound of helicopters grew louder overhead, Jonathan Cross made a promise to himself. He would never walk away again. The call Jonathan Cross made wasn't to a lawyer. It wasn't to the media. It was to a man named Gabriel Torres. 20 years ago, Torres had served under Cross in Iraq. Staff sergeant. Brilliant tactician. The kind of soldier who could turn chaos into precision. When Cross left the military, Torres had stayed, climbed the ranks, made general before retiring to run a private security firm that
handled sensitive situations. Translation: when powerful people needed problems solved quietly, they called Torres. Cross hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. The phone rang twice. "This is Torres." "It's Cross." A pause, then a low chuckle. "Been a while, sir. Thought you'd forgotten about us, little people." "I need you," Cross said. "Now." The humor vanished from Torres's voice. "Talk to me." Cross explained quickly. The twins, the tree, Grace, Marcus Hale and Hale Development, the systematic corruption that had turned Redwood County into a corporate fiefdom. When he finished,
Torres was quiet for a long moment. "You're asking me to mobilize a team for a local land dispute," he said carefully. "That's not usually our—" "I'm asking you to help me save someone I should have saved 15 years ago," Cross interrupted. "And I'm asking you to do it before sunset." Another pause. "How many men do you need?" "However many it takes to make sure no one in that county ever forgets what happens when they think they're above the law." Torres exhaled slowly. "You want a show of force. I want them to know that power has consequences," Cross said quietly. "I want them to understand that they chose the wrong woman to hang from a tree." "Understood. Give me 20 minutes." The line went dead. Cross stood in the middle of that field, Grace leaning against his car, the twins wrapped in emergency blankets, and he made 5 more calls. One to the governor of California, one to a federal prosecutor who'd been building a case against land development fraud, one to a journalist at the Los Angeles Times who'd won a Pulitzer exposing corporate corruption, one to a senator who owed him a favor, and one to his own legal team, with instructions to begin seizing every asset Hale Development had ever touched. By the time he hung up, the wheels were turning. But it wasn't enough, because Hale and his enforcers were still standing there, still armed, still believing they could walk away from this. Cross walked toward them slowly. Marcus Hale tried to look confident. Failed. "You think you can just roll into my county?" he started. "Your county," Cross interrupted softly. "This isn't your county, Deputy. It never was. You're just a man in a costume, playing sheriff for whoever pays you the most." Hale's hand drifted toward his gun. Every one of Cross's security team drew their weapons instantly. Hale froze. "Don't," Cross said quietly. "Because if you draw that weapon, I will make sure you never see daylight again. Not through legal gymnastics, not through a plea deal. You will disappear so completely that even your family will forget your name." "You can't!" "I already have," Cross said. 20 minutes ago, I set things in motion you can't stop. Federal investigators are already on their way. The media will be here within the hour. And by tomorrow morning, the entire state will know what you did to Grace Carter." Hale's face had gone pale. "You're bluffing."
Cross smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "In 5 minutes," he said, "you're going to hear helicopters. Not just medical. Military. Federal. Because I made one phone call to a man who owes me his career. And he's bringing everyone." "This is insane." "No," Cross said. "This is justice. You just forgot what it looks like." He turned back toward Grace, but as he walked away, he said one more thing over his shoulder. "If you run, I will find you. If you hide, I will drag you out. And if you ever come near Grace or her daughters again, I will make you wish you'd hung yourself from that tree instead." Silence. Then, in the distance, the sound Cross had promised. Helicopter blades. Not one, not 2, a dozen, maybe more. The sky was darkening with them. And Marcus Hale, for the first time in his miserable life, understood what it meant to be powerless. The twins looked up at the sound, their faces filled with wonder. "What's happening?" Noah whispered. Cross knelt beside them. "Justice," he said simply, loud and unavoidable. The storm was here. They came like thunder, 12 helicopters splitting the sky over Redwood County, some medical, some federal, one carrying Gabriel Torres and a team of operators who'd seen real war and treated this like target practice.
The downdraft sent dust spiraling across the field. Marcus Hale stumbled backward, shielding his eyes. His enforcers looked at each other, then at their boss, then at the overwhelming display of force descending on them. One of them dropped his weapon, then the other. Hale stood alone, his hand still hovering near his gun as the first helicopter touched down 30 yards away. The door opened. Gabriel Torres stepped out. 50 years old, built like a man who'd never stopped training, eyes that had seen death and decided it wasn't impressive. He walked toward Cross, scanning the scene with military precision. "Sir," he said, nodding. Then he looked at Grace, still leaning against the car, her wrists bandaged, her face pale but alive. "Ma'am, you're safe now." Grace nodded weakly. Torres turned to Hale. "Deputy Marcus Hale?" Hale's jaw tightened. "Who's asking?" Torres pulled out credentials. "Federal Task Force, investigating land fraud, racketeering, and corruption. You're going to want to put your hands where I can see them." "I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," Torres interrupted. "I suggest you use it." Behind him, a dozen operators in tactical gear fanned out across the field, securing the perimeter. Another helicopter landed. This one carried FBI agents and a federal prosecutor who looked like she'd been waiting her entire career for a case like this. She approached Cross first. "Mr. Cross, I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Kim. I understand you have information about systematic land fraud in Redwood County?" Cross nodded toward Grace. "She has the information. I just made the call." Kim knelt beside Grace. "Mrs. Carter, I know you've been through hell."
But if you can talk, I need to hear everything. Grace's voice was hoarse, but steady.
They've been stealing land for years, threatening families, burning homes. They killed my neighbor 6 months ago and called it a suicide. They poisoned wells. They destroyed crops. And every time someone tried to fight back, Marcus Hale made sure they disappeared.
Kim was recording everything. "Can you prove this?"
I kept records," Grace said. "Every threat, every offer, every time they came to my door. It's all in a lockbox under my kitchen floor."
Kim turned to Torres. "Get a team to the Carter residence. I want that lockbox secured as evidence. Now." Torres nodded, already giving orders. The third wave of helicopters brought something unexpected. News crews. 3 of them. National networks. Because Jonathan Cross had made one more call. To a journalist he'd worked with years ago. "Bring cameras," he'd told her. "And bring them live." Now, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, millions of people across the state were watching Redwood County's sins being dragged into the light. Cameras captured Marcus Hale being handcuffed, captured the enforcers confessing on the spot, desperate for plea deals. Captured Grace Carter, alive against all odds, sitting with her daughters, while federal agents swarmed the property she'd almost died defending. And they captured Jonathan Cross, standing in the middle of it all, watching justice finally arrive. A reporter shoved a microphone in his face. "Mr. Cross, what made you intervene in Redwood County today?" Cross looked at the camera, at the millions of people watching. "2 children walked miles to find help," he said quietly. "They were barefoot, terrified, and every adult in this county had already failed them. If that doesn't make you act, you're not human." "Are you planning to pursue legal action against Hale Development?" "I'm planning to make sure this never happens again," Cross said. "Not here.
Not anywhere. The reporter started to ask another question, but Cross turned away. He walked back to Grace. She was sitting on a medical stretcher now, an IV in her arm, her daughters curled against her sides. "Thank you," she said quietly. Cross shook his head. "I'm 15 years too late." "You're here now," Grace said. "That's what matters." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something he'd never thought he'd say again. "I'm not leaving this time." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Jonathan." "I mean it," he said. "Whatever you need, however long it takes. I'm not walking away." The twins looked up at him. "Are you going to stay?" Eli asked quietly. Cross knelt down so he was eye level with her. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to stay." Above them, the helicopters circled. Below them, Marcus Hale was being loaded into a federal vehicle. And for the first time in 15 years, Jonathan Cross felt like he might actually be able to sleep. By midnight, Hale development was
Finished. Not wounded. Finished. The FBI had seized their records. Federal prosecutors had frozen their accounts. Journalists had published exposés revealing a decade of fraud, intimidation, and theft. 12 executives were arrested. 7 county officials resigned. Marcus Hale sat in a federal holding cell, no longer wearing a badge, no longer powerful, no longer anything except a criminal waiting for trial. His enforcers were already cutting deals, desperate to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences. The media storm was relentless. Grace Carter became a symbol overnight, the woman who'd refused to surrender, the mother who'd hung from a tree rather than give up her children's inheritance. News crews camped outside the hospital where she was recovering. Advocacy groups called her a hero. Politicians used her story to call for reforms. Grace hated all of it. "I'm not a hero," she told Jonathan quietly when he visited her hospital room. "I'm just a woman who didn't have a choice." "You always had a choice," Cross said. "You could have signed. You could have walked away. And taught my daughters that fear wins?" Grace shook her head. "No. I'd rather die than teach them that." Cross looked at her for a long moment. "You're stronger than I ever was," he said quietly. Grace reached out and took his hand. "You came when I needed you," she said. "That takes strength too." They sat in silence for a while. Then Grace asked the question that had been haunting her since the oak tree. "Why did you really come, Jonathan? You could have ignored those children. You could have driven away." Cross looked down at their joined hands. "Because I saw myself in them," he said finally. "Desperate, alone, begging someone with power to care. And I remembered what it felt like when no one did." "What happened to you?" Grace asked gently. Cross took a breath. "I was 18, he said. "My mother was dying. Cancer. We couldn't afford treatment. I went to every charity, every foundation, every rich person I could find. I begged them for help, and they all said no. Some of them were polite about it, some weren't, but none of them helped." Grace's grip tightened. "She died 6 weeks later," Cross continued. "And I promised myself that I'd never be powerless again. I'd never have to beg. I'd be the one with money, with power, with control." "And you became everything you hated," Grace said softly. Cross nodded. "For a while, yes. Until I met you. You reminded me that power without purpose is just emptiness." "And then you forgot again," Grace said, not accusingly, just stating fact. "Yes," Cross said. "I forgot. Until your daughters put their hands on my car window and reminded me." Outside the hospital room, the twins were sleeping in the hallway chairs, wrapped in borrowed blankets. Grace looked at them through the window,
her expression soft. "They're so brave," she whispered. "They shouldn't have to be, but they are." "They learned it from you," Cross said.
He said. Grace smiled faintly. Maybe. Or maybe they're just tired of watching adults fail them. That hurt. But it was true. For days, journalists interviewed Grace. Federal investigators took her statements. Lawyers outlined the restitution she was owed. Turned out, Hale Development had done this to 43 families. 43. Most had already lost their land, but the FBI was building cases to return what could be returned. Grace's 200 acres were secured immediately, the deed confirmed, the threats erased. But the damage couldn't be undone completely. The neighbors who'd looked away couldn't meet her eyes now. The shopkeeper who'd ignored her daughter's screams had closed his store and left town. The pastor who'd baptized her children never apologized, never acknowledged what he'd failed to do. Grace learned a hard truth. Justice didn't erase cowardice. It just exposed it. When she was finally released from the hospital, Jonathan was waiting with his car. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. Grace looked at her daughters, at the land she'd nearly died defending, at the man who'd saved her. "Home," she said simply. "I want to go home." Cross drove them back to the Carter property. The old farmhouse was still standing, scarred, but standing. As Grace stepped out of the car, she looked at the oak tree in the distance. The rope was gone, but the memory remained. "I'm going to cut that tree down," she said quietly. Cross nodded. "I'll help." And for the first time in weeks, Grace Carter smiled. 3 months later, the oak tree was gone. In its place, Grace planted a garden. Roses, wildflowers, things that grew towards sunlight instead of holding shadows. The Carter property was healing, slowly. The farmhouse had been repaired. New windows, new roof, a porch swing where the twins sat every evening, reading books Jonathan had bought them. The land was theirs again, legally, permanently, protected by so many legal safeguards that not even the most aggressive corporation could touch it. Grace still woke up sometimes with phantom pain in her wrists, still dreamed about the rope. But she was alive, and in Redwood County, that meant something. The fallout from the scandal had been biblical. Marcus Hale was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. His enforcers got less, but not much. Hale Development dissolved completely. Its assets were liquidated, with proceeds going to the families they'd destroyed. 7 county officials were indicted. 3 took plea deals. 4 went to trial and lost. A new sheriff was elected, a woman from Sacramento with a reputation for refusing bribes and breaking corruption. Slowly, carefully, Redwood County began to remember what justice looked like. But Grace knew the truth. None of it would have happened without Jonathan. He'd stayed true to his word. He hadn't left. Every week he drove up from San Francisco, checked on the family, brought supplies, helped with repairs. The twins adored him.
"Are you going to marry our mom?"
Noah had asked one afternoon, with the blunt honesty only children possessed. Jonathan had choked on his coffee. Grace had laughed for the first time in months. "Noah," Eli hissed, "you can't just ask that."
"Why not?" Noah said. "He's here all the time. He helps save Mom. And he looks at her like people do in movies."
Jonathan's face had gone red. Grace had just smiled. "One thing at a time, sweetheart." But the question lingered. One evening, as the sun set over the new garden, Grace and Jonathan sat on the porch while the twins played in the field. "You don't have to keep coming," Grace said quietly. "We're okay now." "I know," Jonathan said. "Then why?" He looked at her. "Because I'm not okay." Grace waited. "I spent 15 years building an empire," Jonathan said. "Making money, accumulating power, telling myself it all meant something. And then I saw your daughters' faces, and I realized I'd been running from the only thing that ever mattered." "What's that?" "Connection," he said simply. "Meaning. Being part of something that matters more than profit margins." Grace reached over and took his hand. "You saved my life, Jonathan. You saved my daughters. You gave us a future. That means something." "It's not enough," he said. "I want." He stopped. "What do you want?" Grace asked gently. Jonathan looked at the horizon, at the land Grace had fought for, at the twins laughing in the distance. "I want to stay," he said finally. "Not just visit. Stay. Help you rebuild. Help this county heal. Be part of something real." Grace's breath caught. "You'd give up your company? Your empire?" "I'd restructure it," Jonathan said. "Put someone else in charge of day-to-day operations. Focus on projects that actually matter. Land reform, community development, things that help people instead of just extracting from them." "That's a big change," Grace said. "I've made bigger mistakes," Jonathan replied. "Maybe it's time I made a better choice." They sat in silence for a while. Then Grace said something she hadn't planned to say. "I never stopped loving you." Jonathan turned to her, eyes wide. "Even after you left," Grace continued. "Even when I was angry. Even when I told myself I'd moved on. Part of me always hoped you'd find your way back to who you used to be." "I'm not sure I'm there yet," Jonathan said honestly. "No," Grace agreed. "But you're trying, and that's enough." Jonathan kissed her then, soft, careful, like he was afraid she might disappear again. Grace kissed him back, and on the porch steps, Eli and Noah watched with matching grins. "Told you," Noah whispered. Eli rolled her eyes. "You're so annoying." But she was smiling too, because for the first time in a long time, their family felt whole. Not perfect. Healing took time. Trust took even longer. But they had time now. Time Grace had almost lost. Time Jonathan had almost wasted. Time the twins had fought desperately to preserve. As the sun set over
Redwood County, the Carter family stood together in their garden, the place where something terrible had almost happened, now transformed into something beautiful. And Jonathan Cross, the billionaire who'd spent years believing power meant control, finally understood the truth. Power wasn't about dominance. It was about protection. It was about showing up when it mattered. It was about using everything you had to defend the people who couldn't defend themselves. The twins ran toward them, laughing. Grace leaned against Jonathan's shoulder, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Home.